Good morning, good evening, or good night. My name is Terrell Campbell. I am doing a presentation today on Ivan Pavlov and social and behavioral science. And also, we're going to be focusing more so on classical conditioning. Now, the first thing, Ivan Pavlov was born in 1849. He was a Russian physiologist, and he is most famous for his work in classical conditioning. Now, the interesting part about this is that he was actually a physiologist, but he discovered a very, very major principle of psychology. And Pavlov was investigating the gastric function of dogs by analyzing, the salivary glands. He collected this saliva in response to food under different conditions. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit later in our presentation how this related to each other and go more in depth with it. But for now, I'm just going to give you some general information for Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov's work also influenced many Western scientists in the concept of conditioning and learning. And to connect this to what the presentation is about, we're going to talk about how current educational practices and classical conditioning and Ivan Pavlov's theories are connected with each other. So, like I said, his work served as the basis for a thing called behaviorism and has influenced us to examine how humans perceive themselves, their behavior, and especially their learning process. So that's one of the big reasons why we're going over this, is to figure out, okay, how is this learning process and this classical conditioning, how are they intertwined, and how does that affect education, especially for a classroom teacher. Now, the first thing I want to go over with you is learning. We're going to talk about learning first. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs. Learning is defined as a relatively permanent change in behavior or knowledge that occurs as a result of experience. Okay? There are four factors to learning. Learning is inferred from a change in behavior or performance. Learning results in an inferred change in memory. Learning is the result of experience, and then learning is relatively permanent. So now let's kind of go dig deep into what classical conditioning is. Okay? Now I'm gonna give you a very technical term first, or a technical definition of classical conditioning, and then throughout the presentation you'll actually see what classical conditioning is in a very layman's term sense. So, classical conditioning is learning that takes place when an originally neutral stimulus comes to produce a conditioned response because of its association with an unconditioned stimulus. So, what does that mean? Let me give you a little example. So, the first thing I'm going to have you do, you're going to look at this logo here. And as you are looking at this logo, you will see, one, you are automatically going to associate this logo with something. So, what would that be? McDonald's. And for those of us like myself who happen to be a little hungry at the time, our mouths might start to water in response to seeing this logo. So this is what we would call conditioning or learning. That is a learned behavior, and also pretty good marketing too. So let's move on a little bit. So we're going to move on from this very technical definition, and we're going to break down these concepts. So Pavlov and contiguity. So contiguity, what do I mean by that? Contiguity would be temporal association between two events or stimulus that occurred together in time. So essentially what this means is that two things are happening at the same time. So Pavlov came up with this, and this actually ties into Pavlov's classical conditioning, because what he is telling us is that the more closely in time two events occurred, the more likely they were to become associated with each other. So for instance, I hear a bell, or a dog hears a bell, and he's also eating. As those two are happening at the same time, the dog will then respond to the bell just how he would to the food. So, also, Pavlov came to find out as time passes, the association itself becomes less likely. So, let's continue. So let's go over some of these things we heard in that classical conditioning technical definition, and then make it a little bit less technical. So, an unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus is any stimulus that creates an automatic, autonomic, or reflexive response in an organism. Okay? And an unconditioned response. An unconditioned response can be an unlearned response that can be elicited or drawn out from an organism, much like your heart rate, sweat, and tears. Conditioned stimulus. A conditioned stimulus is anything that can be perceived, meaning anything that can happen through your five senses. So you hearing it, you smelling it, feeling it, seeing it, or tasting it. So virtually anything can be paired with an unconditioned stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus. So what classical conditioning is really trying to get to happen is they want this unconditioned stimulus to change into a conditioned stimulus. Okay? And then you have a conditioned response. Anything that can be a unconditioned response can also be a conditioned response. And essentially what, again, that goal is to have this unconditioned response become a conditioned response. So for us teachers, one of the things that happens is we try to get the attention of our classroom. So me putting up my hand is a conditioned stimulus. And what I'm trying to get my students to transition to is a conditioned response. Okay? So, the goal of classical conditioning, again, is to make this unconditioned response become the conditioned response. Okay? Now we're going to move on a little. And the first thing I'm going to show you is a diagram. I'm going to show you a diagram first. Now, in this diagram, we have on one side our unconditioned stimulus goes with our unconditioned response. And our conditioned stimulus goes consequently with our conditioned response. Just makes sense. And what we're trying to do is combine all of these to get the conditioned response out of this subject or the organism. So the first thing I'm going to do is give you a couple of examples. So one example, and I'm going to give you pretty much each way it works. So the conditioned stimulus is a room. The unconditioned stimulus is heat, and then we have an unconditioned response of sweating. And so how would this work? So you have a man, he'll walk into a room, the room is very hot, and the heat of that room would be the unconditioned stimulus. That's something that we haven't tried to make happen. He just happened to walk into that room, it was hot. The unconditioned response, or the autonomous response that's happening from his body to this stimulus, is him sweating. So now, instead of doing that, we're going to let this happen over a consistent amount of time, and what we're going to have is a conditioned response. We're going to put this man into a hot room and have them happen at the same time continuously, and eventually a conditioned response will be for him to sweat, regardless of the room being hot or cold. So as soon as he walks into the room, because he's been conditioned to think the room is hot, he will then sweat. Another example, and Pavlov's most famous experiment. He did an experiment on dogs, like I said, with their salivary glands. And essentially what he found through this is that the unconditioned stimulus that he created was the food. And then the unconditioned response that he got was salivation. So as a dog saw food, he automatically salivated. So, to test his theory, he then chose to have the food out and also have a bell ringing as the food was out, and then have the dog stay in one place, and he started to salivate, clearly because he's hungry. And over time, as those two events were happening, the dog began to associate the bell ring with food. So over time, they took away the food and kept the bell, and the bell started to make the dogs salivate. And as the dogs were salivating, that gave us a conditioned response of salivation. So essentially what this is telling us is that conditioning and learning are the same thing. You can condition an organism to respond in the way that you want it to. Now, how does this all tie into what we do in the classroom? Well, essentially speaking, this has many classroom implications. So the first is, if the teacher is consistent and repetitive with these stimuli, Eventually, students will come to learn and behave properly through classical conditioning. So I'm going to give you an example. Before conditioning, if the teacher counts down from 20 and the class will not clean up. So they're trying to make a countdown from 20 and then also have the class clean up at the same time. But what the teacher is doing is essentially counting down to 20 and then telling the class to clean up. Now, as they're counting down from 20, the students are not cleaning up, but after the countdown, they will then clean up. Now, during conditioning, what that teacher is going to do is tell the class to clean up, and they're going to be counting down from 20. So, for example, all right, class, I need everyone to clean up for me. I'm going to count down from 20, and I need it clean. 20, 19, 18, 17, and so forth. And the class started to clean up. Now, after conditioning, the teacher no longer has to tell the class to clean up. He or she is simply going to count down from 20, and then the class will clean up automatically. So now they have this unconditioned response. They have this unconditioned response of cleaning up to the conditioned response of cleaning up now, simply by hearing 20, 19, 18, 17. So, behavior management is a way that classical conditioning has impacted education. A lot of us teachers do it with nonverbal cues or verbal cues or nonverbal cues. So for instance, for me, in my experience, I've always done a countdown from 5 to get my students to be quiet. So I'll say, all right, students, I need you to be quiet in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I didn't even know that I was engaging in conditioning. So this is one example. I'll give you another example. So before conditioning, a teacher will instruct the class to quiet down, and it'll get quiet, and then clap 3 times, and it will not get quiet. So during conditioning, instead of doing them separately, again, that contiguity, having things happen at the same time, they're going to clap 3 times and then instruct the classroom to quiet down. So, quiet down. And then the class will get quiet. And eventually, you will not have to give the verbal communication. You can simply give the clap of 3 times. So and then everyone should get quiet. So the class or the students have been conditioned to now be quiet. One more example, and hopefully we'll see the pattern, and we will understand what Ivan Pavlov gave to us through classical conditioning. Before conditioning, the students are playing an alphabet song, and the teacher instructs the students to go to their assigned computers. Of course, if you do them separately from each other, the class, as I play the alphabet song, the class will not get up or set up the computer. So that would be the conditioned response that I'm looking for from them. But after I instruct them directly to go to their seats, they're going to do that. So what I want is the alphabet song to simply play, and then the students to then get up and, will set up their computers. So what I'm going to do during conditioning, I'm going to start conditioning them. I'm going to play the alphabet song and then instruct them simultaneously to go to their assigned computers. And then my conditioned response that I'm looking for is for them to get to or set up their computers. And then finally, after conditioning, all I'll have to do is actually just play the alphabet song, and the children will know automatically, oh, I need to set up my computers, or I need to get to my computers. Hopefully, I hope that I've given you some good information. If you have any more questions, please blog or hit the forum and ask. And I hope I've instructed you well. Thank you for your time, and good night.